All right, as you're seated, if you would open your copy of the Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24. It always makes me giggle when you guys get pump faked out by the sit down part. We gotta get that stand up for the scripture reading thing going. All right, 2 Samuel 24 will be our passage this morning. Give you a second to find your way there. If you grew up in a pastor's home or are growing up in a pastor's home, you know that it is the height of pastoral malpractice to use your kids as an illustration. So that is not what I'm doing this morning. I repeat, that is not what I'm doing this morning. But for, you need something to visualize yourself. So let's imagine a make-believe family that has 5 kids, all right? And in that make-believe family that has 5 kids, there's a dad who's a wee bit competitive, and he's especially a wee bit competitive in board games that require strategy, okay? And let's imagine that this make-believe family of 5 with 5 kids has one of those kids that's super competitive too, and surprisingly is actually really good at games like Monopoly, all right? And this make-believe kid is really good at Monopoly, and he tends to beat his dad, and it drives his dad bonkers. And one of the things, not only losing to his son, but one of the things that drives the dad berserk is playing this game with the child, and along the way, as it is readily apparent that the child is going to win the game, this child begins to organize his properties for all to see. And then he begins to organize his money and start to count the money as the game is playing out. And just to showboat a little bit, begins to say to the dad, "Hey, Dad, guess how much money I have?" Right? It's a total punk move. You don't count Monopoly money in the middle of the game in front of your dad who you're beating, all right? You just don't do it. 2 Samuel 24, verse 1. The Lord's anger burned against Israel again, and he stirred up David against them, saying, "Go count the people of Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army, "Go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the troops so I can know their number." 4 questions I want to ask and try to answer this morning from 2 Samuel 24, guiding questions that will move us through this passage. First thing, what did David do wrong in this chapter? What did David do wrong? Second question asked and answered, who's on the hook for this? Meaning, who's ultimately responsible for what David did? What did he do wrong? Who's on the hook for it? Question 3, how are we tempted to follow David's example here? And because we're going to see something that David did wrong, we're saying, how are we tempted to follow the negative example that David sets here? And then question 4, how can I pursue a better way? So what did he do wrong? Who's responsible? How are we more like David than we want to admit? And is there a better way to live? So what did David do wrong? Verses 1 and 2 here. We're told at the outset of the passage that David counted the people. Now, on the surface, on the scale of like 0 to 10 on the centimeter, this thing doesn't even register for most of us, right? It doesn't even show up, particularly if we compare the things that we've seen David do up to this point. This is a really odd thing to get so much attention as being wrong. But it's very clear in the passage that David knew what he was doing was wrong, and that other people around David knew what he was doing was wrong. Continue in verse 3. Joab, remember this is the kind of sideways military commander. Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord the king looks on. But why does the Lord the king want to do this?" Yet the king's order prevailed over Joab and the commanders of the army, so Joab and the commanders of the army left the king's presence to register the troops of Israel. Down in verse 9 now. Joab gave the king the total of the registration of the troops. There were 800,000 valiant armed men from Israel and 500,000 men from Judah. David's conscience troubled him after he'd taken this census of the troops, and he said, "I have sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, because I've been very foolish, please take away your servant's guilt. So notice the phrases that are used here. David and Joab, they say things like, I've sinned greatly, I've committed iniquity, I've acted very foolishly. So coming off the heels of a Saturday of football, this isn't a controversial targeting call in a football game, for those of you that illustration registers for, okay? This is not something that we're debating. Both the sinner and those that are looking on know that what's happening is out of bounds. It is very clearly wrong. But interestingly to us as readers, the Bible never says why it's wrong. We never get a clear conclusion of what's happening. I think there are three likely explanations, and they all kind of come at the same issue, but speak to it from a different way. And I actually don't think these three are mutually exclusive. I think they can all be true. Number one, I want you to consider the purpose of David's counting. Look back in verse 2. David has said that he wants to go and register, and specifically the text tells us there, he wants to register the troops. This is not just the people more broadly, but specifically he wants to register the troops so he can know their number. So some suggest that David was here intentional about wanting to know what size of an army he had amassed. Like how great, how sufficient was his army to continue to fight the foes. If you remember, we're coming on the heels. They're still battling Philistine giants in the land. There's still opposition around. So some suggest that David was in this counting depending on his own strength. He was sizing up his army. Do I have enough for the battle? Even though, and if you're taking notes, this is a good kind of contrast here, remember Jonathan's words to David a few chapters, or a book earlier actually. Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by few or by many. Point being, it doesn't really matter how big of your army is. If God's on your side, he's going to do what he wants to do. And so by counting, some suggest David was usurping the role of God as king over his people. The intention of the king was to be something of an under-king, to trust in the Lord, not like the nations, not to amass power or position, but to stay low. He was to be a little king under God's ultimate kingship. So look at this passage from Deuteronomy 17. So this is God foreshadowing the people having a king in the land, and this is how he describes the king. And I want you, if you know your Bibles, to think about the contrast of what you read here and David's life, and specifically Solomon, who's going to come. When you enter the land, this is Deuteronomy 17:14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations around me. You're to appoint a king the Lord your God chooses. Appoint a king from your brothers. You're not to set a foreigner over you, or one who is not of your people. However, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses, for the Lord has told you, you're never to go back that way again. He must not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart won't go astray. He must not acquire very large amounts of silver or gold for himself. When he's seated on the royal throne, he's to write a copy of the instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest, is to remain with him. He's to read from it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe his words and instructions, and to do these statutes. So his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from his command to the right or the left, and he and his sons will continue reigning in Israel for many years. In other words, kings were meant to stay low. Meant to stay low. They're meant to lead from a place of humility, making it very clear that God was ultimately the king. They're to steward their power for good and not flaunt their superiority. In other words, they weren't to count their monopoly money, right? They weren't to flaunt what God was doing in and through them, and some would suggest that this is exactly what David is doing here. Rather than staying low, David's going high. He's looking over what he's amassed and saying, okay, I've got what I need. In contrast, God is the only one who can look over his creation and see what he's made and say it is very good. David's usurping that role. Second explanation is the Levites' inclusion in this counting. Look again in verse 2. Not only is he told to count all the troops, but he's told to go through all the tribes of Israel and count them. Now this seems natural to us. Count all the people. Everybody that I've got, everybody that can draw a sword. But back in the book of Numbers, God has mandated that a certain group, a certain tribe, actually be excluded from the men who can draw the sword. So this is Numbers 1, verses 47 to 50. But the Levites were not to be registered with them by their ancestral tribe. For the Lord had told Moses, do not register or take a census of the tribe of Levi with the other Israelites. Appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, all its furnishings and everything in it. They are to transport the tabernacle and its articles, take care of it, and camp around it. In other words, I'm going to set off a group of people that are not going to fight because they're going to be primarily tasked with worship of me. They're going to be primarily tasked with the holy things of God. And we're not going to include them in the counting of the fighting men. So it's likely that David did not heed this restriction and instead included the Levites in the count, thereby something like stacking the deck of his army, as it were. I'm not sure I've got enough with, whatever the number was, 750,000, so let's include the Levites, so we bump that number up a bit. And thereby, he was not leaving anyone to attend to the worship of God, as the Levites were instructed to do. So stacking the deck to fight on his behalf and neglecting worship of God. And then there's one other explanation, that David failed to pay the price for this counting. I find this explanation compelling. Let's stay in the Moses census that we were just considering here. So when Moses tells them what to do when they are to take a census, look in, this is from Exodus 30, the Lord speaking to Moses. When you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the men must pay a ransom for his life to the Lord as they are registered. And then no plague will come on them as they are registered. If we fast forward the story a bit in 2 Samuel 24, the result of David's actions is going to be he's going to get three choices, and he's going to choose that God would send a plague, the exact consequence that's foreshadowed here in Exodus 30. So perhaps the issue is that David did not worship God by paying a ransom price before he took this census. He's taking matters into his own hands. He's rushing to do what makes sense to him rather than attending to the worship of God first. And if you've been journeying with us through this series, you know we have ample basis to make that assumption. Because David and others of Israel's kings have been prone to rush into battle without things like bringing the ark along, right? Just doing what makes sense to them. In essence, this act was robbing God, both of worship and service. Because down in Exodus 30, this is verse 16, this price that would have been required before you take the census, verse 16, take the atonement price from the Israelites and use it to service the tent of meeting. It's going to serve as a reminder for the Israelites before the Lord to atone for your lives. So this was a ransom price to pay before you head into battle, and the price that was paid was used for God's worship. So by not offering ransom money, David was demonstrating again that he was more intent on building his kingdom than God's, a pattern that cuts through these books. So any of those explanations I think are fine. They all point to a common foundation, and that is the issue of self-reliance. David's great sin was acting as if David were great. His great sin was exalting himself. And the placement of this census in this book, and then it's mentioned again in the Chronicles story, makes this point. 2 Samuel, this moment comes on the heels of David's song of praise of God's great deliverance. Remember what Brandon taught us last week? And here, the ending of this book, it's placed in contrast. He's celebrating God's great deliverance, but then he's exalting himself, the issue that plagues David throughout his life. David was just singing about God's greatness, and now he's acting like he's all-powerful. In 1 Chronicles, it's placed right after God's great deliverance of the Israelites from the Philistines. God's just shown off his power and might, and now David is flaunting his superiority by trying to do the same thing. Question 2. And this one is on the surface intellectual curiosity, but I think it reveals something much deeper that's super helpful to me. Who's on the hook for what David did? Turn actually a couple of books over to First Chronicles, chapter 21. And if you can, kind of keep your place in both so you can flip back and forth. So 2 Samuel 24 is our primary text this morning. First Chronicles 21 is a cross-reference passage that's telling the same story. And I want you to notice a clear point of distinction here. Who's on the hook for David's sin of self-reliance, for his pride that's demonstrated here? Notice how 24:1 reads of 2 Samuel. The Lord's anger burned again against Israel, and he, being God, stirred up David against them to say, go count the people. Now flip over to 1 Chronicles 21. And if you let your eyes look beginning in verse 2 and on down, the text is almost verbatim a copy of what we see in chapter 24. It's almost exactly lifted, like the author did copy-paste to this text, with one curious change. Look in verse 1. How's this one read? Satan rose up against Israel, and he incited David to count the people of Israel. So David, verse 2, said to Joab, and the text continues, go count the people. So who's to blame here? Is the issue God's? Is the issue Satan? Or is it David? Well, let's consider the role that each of these play in the story. What's God's role? God, in 2 Samuel 24, we're told, is angry at Israel. He's angry at Israel for their ongoing idolatry. He's angry at Israel for the mess their sin has made in the land. And he's going to act to judge their sin and position them once again for great deliverance. And this time, and this is the language I want to be sticky to you, God ordains that it's going to be David's sin that's going to bring that about. God ordains that David's sin will bring about his judgment. God is not the one tempting here. James tells us in James 1:13, no one undergoing a trial should say, I'm being tempted by God. God doesn't tempt by evil. He himself doesn't tempt anyone. So God is not the one tempting David to sin here, but he is ordaining the conditions under which Satan and David can act. Like Job, you remember this scenario at the beginning of the book of Job? Satan presents himself to God. Like Job, the Lord incited David by giving Satan permission to tempt David to do this very thing. Sometimes, in God's divine wisdom, he restrains sin, and other times, he lets it run its course, even ordaining it, such that it brings about the outcomes that he desires, all under his authority. Luther rightly summarized, speaking about this idea, that Satan is the Lord's devil, possessive. He wrote of God having Satan on a leash, right? He's ultimately under the Lord's control and command. So the fact that David is incited to this action does not escape God's notice. In fact, he's ordained it as a means of accomplishing his ultimate act of deliverance. Satan, what's his role? He tempts. God ordains, Satan tempts. The books that we have in our Bible called 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the term there, chronicling, most think it's actually during or after the exile. So writing much later, reflecting back on this stage. It's describing these same events. And as such, they depend on the source material of 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel to write their text. And in this episode, the chronicler wants to make it super clear that it is not God who tempts, but rather Satan in verse 1. Satan is the one who is prowling around like a roaring lion seeking to devour someone. He wants to crush David. Like the snake in the garden, Satan tempts David to act in self-reliance by taking a census of the people. And then lastly, David acts. God ordains, Satan tempts, David acts. And none of these obliterates the other. David is the one who commits the sin. In fact, the text tells us that David had multiple ways of escaping this. Joab comes to him in verses 3 and following and says, hey, David, this is a really bad idea. Fast forward to the New Testament, God giving us a way of escape, you could think and apply here. David has outs here. This is not a deterministic outcome. He could have heeded Joab's warning and not gone forward with the plan, but he didn't. He acted. And the fact that God ordained and that Satan tempted does not obscure the fact that God holds David accountable for his actions. He judges David for his sin. Look in verse 11. David got up in the morning. The word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer. Go and say to David, this is what the Lord says. I'm offering you 3 choices. Choose one of them, and I will do it. So Gad went to David, told him of his choices, and asked him, do you want 3 years of famine to come on the land? To flee from your foes 3 months while they pursue you? Or have a plague in your land for 3 days? Now consider carefully what answer I should take back to the one who sent me. David answered Gad, I have great anxiety. Please, let us fall into the Lord's hands because his mercies are great. But let me fall into human hands. So the Lord set a plague on Israel from that morning until the appointed time from Dan to Beersheba. 70,000 men died, or 1/10 of the number. Almost 1/10. Again, we see just punishment for sin being death. These are the wages that sin earns. And God holds David responsible for this. So the same paradigm is true in our lives. But you think about the progression. God ordains. God superintends. God is over all. Your sin does not escape his foreknowledge, his awareness. And he can and often does use your sinful rebellion to bring you to a place of blessing, to bring you to a place of repentance. Ultimately, Genesis 50:20, your sin. What man intended for evil, God purposed for good. He ordains all that. The enemy tempts. Satan tempts you to rebel, often in very similar forms as David. And you are accountable. It's not God's fault. It's not Satan's fault. But God judges human sin. And the wages of that sin is death. And often, far too often, our sinful actions result from the same foundation that David acts in this chapter. So third question. How am I tempted to follow David's example? How am I tempted to follow David's example? So let me ask you, if you sat down and read, like in one sitting, the story of David's life, start to finish, none of you are going to get to the end of that story and conclude, man, like David's position and his power were like super the result of him being really great. Like dude was crushing it. You're going to notice that from the very start all the way through the story, it's the story of God superintending, God acting in the face of the kid who was last to be picked for kickball, right? I mean, he's the last one to be picked as the successor of the king. The Goliath episode seems to go out of the way to highlight this has nothing to do with David. I mean, it's a scrawny kid with a slingshot and a few rocks. It's highlighting the faithfulness of God. The kingdom is built in spite of him. God is over and over again fulfilling his promises. And David should not be the one who gets the credit. The steady refrain of his sin, in fact, the way this book closes, should make it clear that he's not crushing it. But here, near the end of his reign, David starts counting monopoly money that he didn't earn. He starts flaunting monopoly money that was not his to flaunt. And the prophet Zechariah warns the entire nation against this temptation, and I think in reference us. It's not by strength or by might, but what? By my power, by my spirit, says the Lord. David's kingdom makes this refrain clear, and I would suggest to you that with a moment of self-reflection, your life does as well. Your life testifies to the reality that it is not your might or your power, but God's Spirit at work that's producing anything that you would call good. And yet our lives present countless opportunities for us to give in to Satan's temptation in the area of self-reliance. I'm going to mention just a representative sampling. Our church has a large number of members who come from churched families or Christian schools. Many of you were leaders in your youth group. Some of you were missionary kids. You have parents who are pastors. There is a temptation, isn't there, to count your monopoly money with feelings of moral superiority because you did not succumb to some of the same sins that you saw your peers fall to. Our church is filled with a big group of parents who rightly take the education and development of their kids really seriously. We invest prayer, effort, and instruction to raise mature, well-adjusted kids who are going to do good for God in the world. We're tempted to count our monopoly money by subtly poking out our chest at how good we're doing as parents, and by growing resentful and frustrated of other parents who don't seem to have their act together quite as well as we do. Our church has members who are positioned in places of upward mobility and culture at large. Many of you have good jobs. You've built homes with plans that you designed to perfectly suit your needs. You're positioned to elevate yourself in your career, to make more money, often more money than your parents had. Friends, you will be tempted to count your monopoly money by using these good gifts to make your life easier rather than leveraging them to bless other people. And on a broader level, our church is healthy. I mean, it's rare. Last week we took a 100% vote for our annual budget. $1.6 million. We've added 70 new members over the last year. We baptized today and we'll do so again in a few weeks. We're unified and we're growing. And there will be a temptation for us to count our monopoly money by neglecting prayer, by depending on our own instincts for leadership wisdom, or by insinuating to the world that something good that's happening here is our own doing. These are just a smattering of examples that press against the tendency to take God's good gifts and pretend like we deserve them, we earned them, or we're guaranteed them in the future. James writes, remember that, every good and perfect gift comes from God. In other words, we don't need to flaunt monopoly money that God has won for us. We don't show off our superiority in things that are simply ours as a gracious gift from a good God. Is there a better way to live? David's sin isn't the end of the story in 2 Samuel 24. Notice God's actions, verse 16. The angel extended his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. But the Lord relented concerning the destruction and said to the angel who was destroying the people, enough, withdraw your hand now. And the angel of the Lord was at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Remember, David's given some options here. He stakes his life on the mercy of God. He knows that God will judge his sin, so he chooses to allow God to send this plague. And the end of this chapter tells us he's exactly right to do so. Because God's mercy does, in fact, have the final word. Like the Exodus before, remember the scene? The angel of death stays his hand, relents from judgment. Here at the threshing floor of Araunah, an unknown, obscure figure. Just some random guy, seemingly. And in this way, Christian, We are all Aruna the Jebusite. The wrath of God that our sin deserved was given to Christ. When the angel of death came to our house, the Lord stayed his hand because the blood payment for our sins was on Jesus. All that we have, all that we are, is ours because of the mercy of God. And in response to this mercy, David worships. Notice verse 17. David saw the angel striking the people. He said, look, I'm the one who's sinned. I'm the one who's done wrong. These sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's family. Gad came to David that day and said, get up and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David went up in obedience to Gad's command, just as the Lord had commanded him. Araunah looked down and he saw the king and his servants coming toward him. So he went out and he paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. And Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? David replied, to buy the threshing floor from you, to build an altar to the Lord, so the plague on the people may be halted. Araunah said to David, my lord the king, take whatever he wants, offer it. Here are oxen, burnt offerings, and threshing sledges, and ox yokes for the wood. Your majesty, Araunah gives everything to the king. And the king said, may the Lord your God, and then he said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king answered Araunah, no, I insist on buying it from you for a price, for I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. David brought the threshing floor and the oxen, 20 ounces of silver. He built an altar to the Lord there, offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. The Lord was receptive to the prayer for the land, and the plague on Israel ended. The mercy of God results in the worship of God's people. This is how this passage ends. Worship is the medicine that cures our sickness of self-reliance. And no longer the kind of worship that this passage describes, the kind that requires bulls and goats, but the whole life worship that Paul speaks of in Romans 12. And here, notice David's premise for buying the threshing floor. It continues to hold true in our day. We don't offer to God that which cost us nothing. Rather, we worship him in the place where his mercy meets sin. What's most fascinating about this passage is the outcome. The threshing floor, the place where mercy met sin, the place where the plague stopped, the one that was used as a simplistic worship site in 2 Samuel 24. It didn't stay that way. Well, it did stay a place of worship, but it didn't stay a simple threshing floor, because it was on this very site that David's son Solomon would build the magnificent temple that would stand as a living testimony of the worship of the triune God in the place where mercy met sin. God's people would continually be reminded that their means of interacting with the world would be from a place of humility and worship, not a place of pride and self-reliance. It's amazing to see. God ordained David's sin to be the means that would lead him to the place where he determined to be worshiped among his people. And it's at this place, the place where mercy meets sin, that we continually reorient ourselves away from self-reliance and toward God-exalting worship. This is the better way to live. Friends, we don't count monopoly money that God has earned for us. Rather, we stay low in humble reliance on God, who is the gift giver of every good and perfect gift. We affix ourselves to the place of mercy. I don't think it's any mistake that Paul's famous passage begins that way. Remember? Therefore, in view of God's mercies, let us offer this whole life sacrifice to God, our good, pleasing, and perfect worship to him. Living sacrifices know how silly it is to flaunt monopoly money that they didn't earn. And they choose to stay low, affix themselves to a place of mercy, and live a God-oriented life of worship. With that in mind, let's reflect on the text this morning with a couple of minutes of silent prayer, personal reflection. I ask you to consider the place where mercy met your sin and reorient yourself away from pride and self-reliance and toward humility, toward whole life worship to the triune God. After a moment or two of silent reflection, I'll end our time with a word of prayer.